Hi, I'm Catherine O'Donnell from People's History Museum in Manchester. I think I've been put into a little bit of a Museum of London sandwich, so I'm the filling. So People's History Museum, if you've not heard it before, it's the National Museum of Democracy and the home of ideas worth fighting for. So we tell the story of how people fought for the right to vote, for better working conditions, shorter working hours, the history of the trade union movement, various strikes, protests and demonstrations. Basically, if someone stood up and got angry about something, then we cover it in the museum. In 2013 to 15, worked on a project called Play Your Part, which was funded by Arts Council England, which was all about how we made the museum more relevant to our visitors by researching campaigns of the past, linking them to campaigns of the present in the hope of inspiring activists of the future. So this is the museum, and we were very keen to make people into activists. This was an arts project that one of our artists in residence did called the People's Protest. What I'm going to talk to you about today is how we connected with activists to collect contemporary material and specifically relating to protest. People's History Museum has got the largest collection of political material in Britain. And it's all about basically how working people demanded a better world, the fight for the vote, reform, equality and protest. We have the largest collection of trade union, political and campaign banners in the world, including the oldest in the world. And we have a massive collection of photographs, posters, political cartoons, badges, lots and lots of different things. This is just a small selection of some of the things we have on display in our galleries. So with Play Your Part, we wanted to collect material of campaigns that were in living memory, so working in collaboration with audiences and communities. A key part of the project was to involve people who would play their part in creating the Museum of Democracy for the future. So that kind of ethos of the whole project, that participatory ethos, was what we wanted to do in terms of the collecting. It was collecting the objects was important, but it was that process of engaging with the activists and building those relationships was just as important. Prior to the project starting, we collected very passively, so people would sort of offer things for donation and we'd either accept it or decline it. This is kind of the first time that we'd gone out and actually been very proactive in asking for stuff. Obviously we got some advice from different people, so met with Bishopsgate Institute and University of Sheffield, who have been doing similar projects, working with campaigners just to find out some top tips on how to go about doing it. They were really, really helpful. And I'm not a collections person, so I work with our curator and collections officer to sort of define the scope of the project. Campaigns within living memory is obviously massive and couldn't go out and do everything at once. So we decided that we'd sort of take the project as a starting point and identified a couple of areas that we wanted to focus on. One of those was peace campaigns, and one was the student protests from cuts to funding and tuition fees and things like that. So we decided to take different approaches for different activists because they have very different demographics, and I'll talk a little bit about how we did that. We also set up a blog post and a page on the website to kind of get the word out there to people that were actively collecting material. And we found that activists were very well networked and involved in multiple campaigns. So you'd find that a peace campaigner was involved with lots of other different things, so we could actually broaden the scope that way as well. So for the peace activists, we identified local groups to approach. As another strand of the project was creating different pop-up exhibitions. So we worked with Greater Manchester CND on this installation called Another Gentle Season. So we'd already started building up those relationships, and I think that was a really important part of doing it. We contacted groups via email, phone and attended meetings. So went and sat in on a lot of CND meetings. And we found that the peace activists tended to be older people, and they work better with that face-to-face contact. We also were involved, so this was the workshop that we did with the Another Gentle Season installation, and this was an activist. She'd been to a conference in Japan and got this tattoo of the crane done and found the badge in our collection, so it was really nice making those connections. There was a project going on at the time called Wool Against Weapons, which was creating a 7-mile-long peace scarf that would be stretched from Aldermaston. And that we actually did a knit-in at the museum. So we were kind of like creating the collections as well as collecting it. I also, we were in touch with the Rochdale and Littleborough peace group, and we actually went and stood at their stand in Rochdale Town Centre in February. It was very, very cold and quite bleak. But actually being there and sort of whilst they were doing the protesting, kind of built those relationships as well. And then I went to one of the meetings in this lady's house, and it was amazing. Got lots of tea and cake, but also just she's got this vast collection of banners and t-shirts, and I was just sat there taking pictures of everything, and then my phone ran out of battery. But it was incredible, and sort of having somebody there to talk about what everything meant to them and who had made it and why it was made. That information we don't have in a lot of our collections because it's kind of been sort of found sort of quite piecemeally. So having those personal stories has been really, really valuable to us. And these are a couple of other sort of peace banners that we've collected. For the student protests, we took a different approach and went via Facebook. Social media was a really good way of getting in touch with student activists, just going writing messages on lots of different Facebook groups. We had a good response, but we didn't actually get as many things donated. People said, oh, I've got this, I'll send it in, and then just never sent them in. You know, there's only so many times you can chase somebody up. We also went out to Barton Moss. They had an anti-fracking camp in Salford, and we just went to go and chat to people and let them know who we were and what we were doing and why we wanted some stuff, and just said when the camp's finished, you know, when you've won or lost, we'd quite like some of your stuff, and we took photographs. And we, you know, about a year later, a guy called Climate James got in touch with us, and he donated some of the signs, so they're now in our collection. So these things are quite long term. It's not, you know, you don't just nip down and someone gives you something. You've got to build up those relationships. It's not like Dassel at the North, I promise. It's lovely. We're also quite handy in that the museum is right next to the courts in Manchester, so we're right next to the Civil Justice Centre, and we often find that a lot of people use that as a place to protest. So a lot of them are quite niche. It's the family court, so you get a lot of people protesting against decisions that have been made, kind of like Fathers for Justice, that sort of thing. But there are some things that tie into the national story. We're a national museum, so it's very difficult to find that balance between things that are local issues that are interesting but maybe don't fit within our national remit and the things that are happening across the country. So the anti-bedroom tax campaign was obviously something that was really significant for many, many people across the country. So when this protest was happening, nipped out, took some photos, went and chatted to the activists. I just said, oh yeah, when you finish, if you want to pop into the museum, we'd be really interested in collecting some of your protest materials. So they dropped in, went to the cafe for a brew, and donated some of their placards there and then. We also followed that up. A colleague went to one of the meetings of Bolton against the bedroom tax, and they donated a lot more material, including photographs from demos and things like that. We also, as I mentioned earlier, were running a series of pop-up exhibitions about different themes. and we collected material through those exhibitions. This one here was during the Scottish referendum campaign. So we had material from the yes and the no sides. For that, because we're not based in Scotland, it wasn't easy for us to go out and speak to activists and collect the material that way. So we just phoned up Beach Campaign and just asked them to send in some protest materials. And for every election and general election, we ask people across the country to send in their election leaflets. So we'll be doing the same during the EU referendum as well. This one was an exhibition called Pride in Progress, which was co-produced with members of the LGBT community in Manchester. And we identified that our LGBT collections were quite small and we wanted to expand them. And co-producing this exhibition was a starting point in developing those relationships with people. And we acquired some objects during this, including a Communards picture disc, which kind of came full circle because we had an event with Reverend Richard Coles last year, and he came and saw it, and it was quite exciting. And that is something that we have continued to work on. And really excitingly, we're going to be working on a project called Never Going Underground in the build-up to the 2017 anniversary of 50 years since the partial decriminalisation of homosexual acts. So we're going to be continuing working with those contacts that we initially made and more members of the LGBT community in Manchester to co-produce a major exhibition and do a lot of community engagement work and build our collections even further. So during this, we had to set up new systems. So before, as I said, it was all done very ad hoc. Someone would, a member of the public would say, I've got this, do you want it? We'd say yes or no. It would kind of either be our registrar or our curator that would kind of make the decision independently. I'm sure you all have amazing systems, but we really didn't. So we set up an acquisitions panel which has representatives from the collections department, from the learning department, conservation, archives, so that any new objects that come in, we can decide as a group whether it's something that fits within our collecting policy, we can care for it properly, and also that, you know, it will be used to engage with people as well. This has allowed for a great incoherency in what we collect and has developed a more transparent, democratic and responsive process. However, I disseminated initial findings to a group, and someone said, oh, why don't you have a community member on the panel? And I put this to our curator, and he basically said that we sort of decided not to do that for a number of reasons. That community members would have little knowledge of what is in the collection already, or historically why it contains the objects it does. We need lots of members to have a balanced view. Especially as the collection is so political, it's very difficult to find a balanced view. If community members were given the same voice as paid staff, it would be problematic as they have no legal stake in the organisation, only emotional, and therefore have no responsibility for storing the objects and paying for conservation and things like that. But then if they didn't have an equal voice, then ethically it's problematic because it's just tokenistic for them being there. So it's sort of just making us decide, like, at what level do we keep that engagement. We've also found that a lot of the contemporary material that we've been getting in is purely been digital. So we had to write a new digital collecting policy and a digital accessing form. So this is something that we're still learning and still working on. The main challenges and successes of contemporary collecting for us, the main thing for me was going out, forging relationships, asking for material, people offering it to us, and then I had to take it to the acquisitions panel and they said no because it's not in our collecting policy. So which is quite problematic when you've kind of been really enthusiastic. Yeah, we really want your stuff. It's really exciting. It's to be kept for the future. So it's managing those relationships and managing those expectations, which is a really important part of it. So what I did is I wrote like a plain English guide about how we collect material and what the process is, and that, we really, really value all sort of offers, but it might be rejected because of these reasons, just so that people are aware from the start that even though we're asking for things, we might not necessarily be able to take it. In terms of other lessons learned, it's really important to be proactive. You need to be persistent in order to develop contacts and sometimes nag a bit. And knowing the audience and different methods for reaching out to people. It might be physically having to go to a meeting, it might be using social media. It just depends on who it is you're working with. And thinking of having more of a strategic approach in collecting objects and stories when visiting activist groups, sort of having, or it sounds stupid, but having like the forms ready in case people have brought stuff and things like that, which I didn't really think about at the time. So what we need to be thinking about is being aware of current events as they're happening and how we're going to be more responsive. And I think that's something that we're working on. Since the project ended, it's identifying those protests that are of national importance, and then how we get that material straight away. Being based in Manchester, obviously a lot of protests and demos happen in London, so it's making sure that we can get that, and that's something that's still being worked on. We are quite a small team. And keeping those relationships going with activists long term, especially after a fixed project has finished, is something that's also really, really important to do. To encourage community groups to engage in other ways with the museum, so not just through donating material, but through maybe proposing to have an exhibition in our community gallery, to bringing groups in for our learning programme. So those relationships aren't just about objects, it's about how they work with the museum generally. And being able to, when we get something in, tell people about it. So use our blog, get people who donate the material to write blogs in their own words, so we get those personal stories too. And we continue to have the regular acquisitions meetings. I mentioned a little bit about what we're doing now. I think one of the main things is after the project finished, I was working specifically on the project as the engagement events officer for Play Your Part. After the project is finished, I was then put into the collections and exhibitions team. Even though I'm not a curator, my role is engagement and events, so it's making sure that it's that presence and it's that crossover across the organisation, that the collections aren't just things that are going to gather dust. It's something that is very active and worked on as a team. And yeah, that's the main things. Thank you for listening.